Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Well, folks, it's another episode of the In Focus podcast presented by the Artist Index and graciously supported by Heavenly Spirits. And as per usual, I've said this 100 times already. Actually, this is going to be 140 times now, yeah, at least. Have the guests introduce themselves and spell their name. Guest?
Yes, my name is Dana Smith. That's Dana Smith. I live in Fairhaven, and for most of my career, I've been a photographer. And for the last 2 years, I've mostly made my living as an illustrator.
I think I remember you and I were present at a historic event in Westport, but we were just a spit over the line to Fall River. I don't know how you got involved, but I'll tell you what happened that morning. I'm on my way into New Bedford to work at what was then the Tatro advertising agency. And I saw this column of smoke on 195. I'm like, what the heck is that? I get off the exit onto Route 6 and it's like, wow, that column of smoke is like huge. Like, wait a minute. It was the Kerr Mills.
Yeah,
And
right.
it was a completely involved. And it was so hot that it was burning the siding off of where the advertising agency is. And Paul Slight was our graphic designer, a relatively new hire. And just on a sad note, I was shocked to find out about Gary Rigo passing away.
Yeah.
Because I used to joke about, they would say, where did you get Paul? And I would say, in the men's department at Sears. Because I met Gary Rigo there shopping, and I said, we're looking for another graphic designer at the agency. And he says, have I got a guy for you? And
Yeah.
Gary and I used to, I was a long-term substitute in the New Bedford public school system in middle school level. And I think I knew Gary from before, but I can't remember when. But anyway, I just found out about his passing. It's like a shock.
Yeah, I hadn't seen him in years. He was my art teacher in junior high school at Nemandin.
Wow.
And when he came to Stang, I had just left. Like, he came in the fall of '83. I had graduated in June, so I missed that whole line. But he was my 7th grade, 8th grade art teacher at Nemandin.
I think he replaced Jim Economos. I couldn't remember before, but I just remembered now. Jim Economos, because I used to sub for Jim and I used to co-teach with him as well. But anyway, how did you get involved? Because I all of a sudden, we were afraid because you just went on your merry little way towards the fire, and you got some spectacular shots.
I don't when I was down there, I was in school. You know, it was one of those things. I was living in Boston and I had class that day. I was a photojournalism major. And we got the class, and my teacher said, look, there's a huge fire in Fall River. We should be there. So we jumped in cars, we drove, and everybody jumped, just ran out of the cars, and we ran willy-nilly all over the place as close as we could get. And we spent like 2 days there.
Wow. Now, did you sell any of those shots? I mean, did you get any of the key?
No, because like every other photographer in New England was there too.
Yeah.
But as a student, this was like great because the governor showed up. Dukakis was governor, and he showed, so that was that kind of like, learning, that was on the job training. You're side by side with all the Globe guys and the Herald guys. So, I was a kid, but all my heroes are standing there right next to me making pictures. So.
Wow. Yeah. And those are the guys that had the little license plate that said press on it, or press
right.
photog,
Yeah,
right?
good parking spots. So we just unloaded from cars and just like started running. So
yeah. What happened from that point?
I graduated and I started working I worked for the Standard Times for 10 years. And when I worked, with advertising, I mean, I did what most artists do. You piece it together. I worked for St. Luke's Hospital. I worked for Tatro, anybody who needed a photographer. And I did a lot of work for the Standard Times, kind of as their top stringer. So I was working 6 or 7 days a week. And that's what I did for a long, long time. And at the Standard Times, that top stringer, it's like as soon as a staff person leaves, that slot usually opens up for that person. But
Yeah, death or retirement, I guess.
yeah, which didn't happen a lot. They had 4 photographers, but they were there for a long, long time. And
Who was there when you were there? Because I mean,
Ron
there's some.
Nicolo,
Oh yeah,
Ron was there, Hank Seaman, Jack Idden, was a good friend, and Mike Valeri.
all
And,
all superstars.
yeah, and by the time but what ended up happening, I was there for a long time, and by the time someone left, I realized I didn't want to be a news photographer anymore. So, it was great to do, and I still miss it, but it was by that time I was doing a lot of magazine work, and I just kind of moved on to magazines.
Speaking of
I
which,
got an agency in New York, Black Star Agency, which was pretty legendary, although sort of at the end of its run when I got there. But it got me into New York, and they, all those introductions, got me into the national magazine scene, and and I did that for a long, long time. I'm still doing it.
I was an avid reader of Yankee magazine.
Mhm.
Then they changed it from digest size to full spread. It like everything else. Things never stay the same.
Right.
We were talking about that before we started recording. If it's not broken, don't fix it. And businesses have this thing like they constantly have to be fixing something that's working perfectly fine, but they seem to ignore the things that actually need to be fixed. That people are always saying, "Hey, it would be great if." But anyway, so your name shows up in Yankee magazine. Now the big gun at the time was Moskowitz. Jim, it was a Polish last name. He did these incredible, landscape. He was basically a landscape seascape photographer. I don't believe he did people or I don't even know what category that fits into. He would produce calendars every year.
Right.
And then
Perfect
boom.
for Yankee magazine.
Yeah. And then boom, there you are. How did that happen?
Well, Yankee, Yankee magazine, if any magazine was more the same for a long, long time, it was Yankee magazine. But as their readership started getting much older and it started becoming grandparents, like their demographic was getting too old, they tried to, kind of, move that. And so they started bringing in more, stories, more not quite photojournalism, but more editorial work. And, when, as as an artist, you're constantly promoting. So anybody who's got a publication is hearing from me, multiple times a year. So it just, a lot of times you just have to get to the point where they say, geez, we really should start working with people and doing human interest stories and a little more photojournalism. And then hopefully the art director says, you know what, I know somebody. And at that time, that was me. And I became their people person. I became their in-house photojournalist. Anytime, and they didn't do a lot of those stories, but a couple times a year they would call me up and say, "Hey, look, you want to go fishing?" And they sent me out for a couple of weeks on a boat out of New Bedford, and and that's kind of how it went. But I had no idea how many people saw Yankee, and I'll still see people to this day say, "Oh yeah, I see you're working Yankee," and they'll bring up a story from 20 years ago, which I can't even believe they would remember.
What are some of those stories? What are some of the stories, the big ones that you remember the most?
I mean, it's mostly like the people you meet. There was, I can't remember her name. She was a grandma, but she used to walk across the country. I did a boxing story on a guy, his name was John Wood, and he owned a boxing gym up in like the northern part of Vermont. But he was like, one of the very few African-American people in the community, and he had a gym. And again, it was not a Yankee story, but it was in a very Yankee location. So I went up there and for a couple of weekends, I spent time with him, and while he was training kids. I spent a summer with Circus Smirkus, which is out of Vermont. It's a kid circus, but it's serious stuff. It's not just like kids goofing around. Like they train with circus professionals and they travel around New England all summer. They've been doing it for a long time. And I went up there, I don't know, I ended up spending a summer with the circus, not performing, but photographing the performers. And I definitely lost money on that project because I was supposed to go up about 3 or 4 times. And I ended up spending the summer with them. But, you know, it was such a great opportunity. And, you know, when you're photographing performers and entertainers, you know, it's a gold mine for pictures. So those are the ones that stick in my head. And also when they would call me in, they tended to be 14 to 16 page stories. So it wasn't, you know, it was pretty extensive, and you don't get that very often in publication. So that was fun too.
How long did you stay with them, and why did you leave?
Yeah, you never leave. You know, it's kind of like, you know, when you eat, you know, blueberry ice cream for 2 years because it's your favorite, and then you get sick of it and you move on, and 10 years later you decide you like blueberry again. You know, the magazine would change. They changed the format. They go back to more cooking stories or more scenics, and they don't want to do the photojournalism thing anymore, and so I'm out. Or they bring in a new art director comes in, and the first thing they want to do is put their stamp on it, and they don't want to do anything that looks anything remotely like what they've done in the past 10 years, which means that if I've worked for them the past 10 years, I'm now out because they don't want me. But then, you know, it comes back around and somebody new comes in and they say, oh my God, I love your work. You know, it's like, have you ever done work for us before? It's like, yeah. So, you know, it's had, you know, I'm kind of on and off. I haven't worked with them. The last thing I did for them was about 2 years ago. I did a Santa Claus convention, which was a blast, you know, because it was just like it was a room full of, you know, like 200 Santas. And I was the only photographer in the room. It was great. You know, so they still call every once in a while, but now I'm not even doing so much photography. So now I have to reintroduce myself to them sort of as an illustrator. And you know, and sometimes they can't make this, you know, they can't make the switch.
How did the photo illustration come about?
The photo illustration when pandemic, you know, I'd been working as a photographer, and business was okay, but most of the money, most of the jobs I had was with universities and colleges. So everything Brown, Harvard, Dartmouth. You know, now with all the magazines kind of dying out, colleges are the ones with the money, and they put out beautiful publications. And they have great art departments and art directors. So most of the work I was doing was with universities. And when the March of 2020, 2020, when everything shut down.
Yeah, 19, I think 2019.
Yeah, when that happened, the first thing that closed down were the college campuses. It sent everybody home, and they said, look, you know, we're all going to, you know, go into confinement, and hopefully in another year or two, everybody will come out and we'll all be safe. And I said, well, this isn't going to be good for business, because most of the people I photograph are now home and we can't go out. But the colleges kept putting out a magazine. But what started happening was they would call me and they'd say, hey, remember that professor you photographed in 2010? Do you still have those pictures? You know, so they were raiding my archive, which is fine, but it doesn't pay very well. You know, they're buying up pictures that they've already used or from those shoots. So I kind of thought, you know, maybe if I could take old cake and put on new frosting, maybe I could sell them as new. So I started taking some of the old files and trying to spice them up a little bit. And it didn't really work out, but somewhere in that process, I started, you know, you start cutting and pasting and moving things around the canvas. And I kind of liked what I was doing. I was playing, and I started putting together these photo illustrations, and I liked them. You know, nobody cared if I was doing them or not. And I eventually started to reach out to art directors and show them the work. And it just kind of, they bid on it, you know. And surprisingly, you know, I ended up with meeting an agent. Well, I reached out to a lot of agents the same way I would do as a photographer. And one agent from Mendola Artists. They said, I love your work. And I said, are you sure? Because I've only been doing this for like a year. They said, we don't care. And ever since then, I've been I would say 85% of my work now is in illustration.
It's quite a journey, quite a change of direction in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when I started doing it, you know how it is, right? You do something and you like it, but it's like, okay, well, that's fine. It's nice that you dabble. It's nice to tinker. It's nice to explore things. But to reach out to the same places, reach out to the New York Times or the Washington Post and actually be taken seriously, it's kind of, those people kind of say, okay, look, maybe just pump the brakes here a little bit. You're having fun, that's great, but illustrators spend their lifetime becoming, illustrators, and this isn't the place to play. But what I realized was that illustration, photography, probably all kinds of art, it's we're all doing the same thing. It's storytelling. We need to build a narrative. You need to read the brief. You need to read the story. You need to understand who's the important players in the piece. And then you have to build a tone, and you have to create a mood, and all of the things that I did in photography. Where does the subject go? Do I put the subject in the middle of the frame, on the edge of the frame, the top or the bottom? Do I choose green or yellow or red or blue? All those creative decisions, it doesn't change when you go from photography to illustration.
But it's slower. It's a slower process. I mean, you have like milliseconds in some cases to shoot to pull a shot off, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, with photography, that's the big difference, is that with photography, when the shoot's over, it's all over.
Mm-hmm.
You can, I would be driving home from my assignments, and of course, all the great pictures in my head that never happened because I'm thinking of them now, but not 3 hours earlier. But when it's done, it's done. You send it to the editor, and they look and they say, okay, well, if they don't like it, that's all you got. We can't do it again. With illustration, you can go back and redo and refix and revise, and and in a lot of ways that's good, but in many ways it's bad because it's never done.
I remember when the digital took over, illustrators were probably one of the first people to get feel a pinch. Let's put it that way, because it was a handcraft. I went to University of Miami. I've mentioned him several times before on these podcasts. Leon Rosenblatt. His most famous piece is probably Man of Miracles on a Styx cover, and that was just one of the pieces that he did for RCA Records. Because he was at RCA, he was affiliated with NBC. Because he was affiliated with NBC, he was at Saturday Night Live when it first started off. And then I think he was doing pocketbooks or silhouettes, or those big bulky guy holding woman with low cut dress over one arm, and and Leon had this system where he could knock off these pieces like in 3 hours. That was his thing. And when digital came along, those guys seemed to be shoes on a goose. I mean, it didn't really make any, I don't know why. Because now, we can use photography more. Because before, remember the halftone process, right? It was such a complicated deal that illustrators were usually generally called in because they were kind of a cost-cutting measure in some ways, budgetarily. So now everything flip-flopped on them, So now here you are going almost back to full circle.
Well, yeah, but it's funny because, like, I remember, when you talk about the changes, my students, when I taught for 20 years at New England School of Photography, and so I started teaching, and it was all film. We were shooting chromes, so and when digital came along, that was a huge change, and my students were in a panic. Oh my God, digital and everything's going to change. And they was just like, you don't even have to know how to expose. You do it all in the camera, and you don't have to learn how to correct for light. And I would say, well, look, this has been happening forever. I said, when you see those old pictures of Joe Louis prize fights, you see on the side of the ring, all those photojournalists, they have their speed graphics with their hats with the press thing. Like a speed graphic, you have film and you load it like you have a a holder and you slide it in and you expose your film and you pull the holder out, you flip it over, and it's a very slow process. And I always would say to them, what do you think happened when the first guy showed up at ringside with an SLR with a motor drive? And while they can only make like 20 pictures in a 15-round fight, this guy's just firing off their, 3 frames a second. They must have thought that's the end of photography. You don't have to be a photographer. You don't have to anticipate. Just sit on the button, and you're all set. And so I think that's always been going on. Photography still went on. We just had new tools and we learned how to use them. And then as it kept on advancing, digital was just another way. You still have to be a thoughtful artist. You still have to have skills. You still have to think. You still have to anticipate. That hasn't changed. It's quicker. And at the speed that we can deliver it is so much faster, but you still have to make decisions. You still have to make creative decisions and anticipate what's going to happen, and still have to tell stories and build narratives. So it's different tools, but like with illustration, I'm just not using a camera anymore. I'm sitting in front of my computer, but I'm still making the same decisions I've had to make for the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah. How is AI going to affect you? To bring up.
Yeah.
Some people have a bad taste in their mouth already about it.
Sure. I mean, as far as like my work, I don't think it'll change. I mean, I'm an editorial artist and illustrator, so I'm hired not so much for my computer skills, but for being able to solve a problem, to tell the story, to think. They come to me and they say, okay, we're illustrating a story about this, that, and the other. And I called you because I don't know how the hell we're going to illustrate that. And I have to figure out how to do that in a visual sense. So I don't think it'll affect me that much. I think it would tend to affect people who are doing a lot, like you just said, like somebody who sits down and is drawing or working on the computer, that would take them 3 days to do something, or even 1 day to do something. Or like your friend, to knock it off in 3 hours, but an art director or a company can have that in 3 minutes, or a reasonable facsimile, which is good enough for them. So I guess it depends on what you have to do. I mean, what you do, but I don't think it's really going to affect most artists, and especially now because it's all the rage. I think that it's going to settle down, just like digital. I remember with digital photography, when it first started up in Camden, Maine, up where the main workshops are, Kodak opened up like the creative digital center for photography, and they had all the new stuff. They had all the computers, they had Photoshop, and all the best photographers in the world went up there. They had to go to Camden and had to learn all this stuff. And so there was all the superstars up there. And they would travel there, and they created some of the worst work ever, in the history of photography. It was crap, because, just like we all do, we sit at the computer like kids, like they just pressed every button and they tried everything. It's like, oh my God, look at this, how cool this is. And it was garbage, but we had to go through that process, right? You have to go through the process of trying everything and thinking it's great, and then sit down with it and look back and say, that's really not very good. That's just a filter. That's just a lot of color. That's just a lot of patterns, but it's not good photography. And once everybody's settled down, they figured out, although we have 100,000 buttons we can push, that doesn't mean we should be pushing any more than like 6 or 7 of them. And I think that with AI, the same thing will happen. We'll start to recognize what it is, and then it'll be like, okay, that's AI. But if you really want something thoughtful and creative, you're still going to have to call an artist to do what they do. And we'll use AI for certain things, but it won't be the solution. It's not the button you press and say, "Ooh, we just saved ourselves 6 months of work."
Yeah, AI is a tool, just like the camera was a tool. I was telling somebody, having this discussion, I remember playing for my classes, believe it or not, my marketing classes and my art history classes, A Century of American Photography. And it was wonderful how the first episode shows the aftermath of a tornado somewhere in Kansas or in the Midwest. And there's devastation everywhere. And these people gathered in the school cafeteria, which hadn't been destroyed. And there are wet, moldy, stuck together photographs laid out all over these tables in the cafeteria. And these people are going systematically from one table to another, looking for the photos of their loved ones that got sucked out of their houses.
Right.
And it's got to, a lot of people didn't get it. It's like, okay, your life has been completely turned upside down. And one of your priorities right now, not where we're going to sleep tonight, not where we're going to get the next meal, is they're looking for those memories. They're looking for that validation, that documentation, all that other stuff. And then they moved on to Nice in Paris, in developing the camera. He didn't invent the camera. That's, that's a whole nother conversation. You know that because you taught photography. But within, I think they said 6 months of him coming out with the process, the Paris Vice squad had busted like over 1,000 individuals for pornography. I mean, photography hadn't even made the 1-year anniversary, and the people had already figured out a way how to use the tool.
Right. Yeah, it's a tool. And I've never been a tool guy, a gadget guy. Photographers are notorious for gear stuff and talking about all the photography, all the specifications and the speed of the lens and this, and that's always been the least interesting thing about photography to me. And even when I was as a photographer, my assistants would make all my decisions about equipment for me. I'd say, look, what do I need? And they say, well, they got this. And it's like, okay, either buy me that and I'll pay you for it, or I'll just go, give me a list and I'll go buy it, because I don't want to think about that stuff. I don't want to think about the tools. If you're building a house, I want to see a beautiful house. I don't need to see what kind of hammer and screwdriver and drill the person doing the construction is using. I don't care. I'm glad,
as long as it works.
As long as they make a beautiful house, then I could care less if they're using sticks and rocks.
Yeah, I have a friend, another one in Miami. He was a year ahead of me. Of Leon Rosenblatt and myself, Bill Tuttle. He was the Ferrari photographer at Daytona.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of his claims to fame, and he was a Leica freak.
Right.
I mean, my God, just saying Leica, and you would see this man melt in his boots.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them. I mean, and again, for like Leica to a photojournalist or documentarian is almost necessary, because it's the right tool for the job. It makes sense, and they are beautiful cameras, but it depends on what you do. When I went out, I think when I first started out and I wanted to get my first medium format camera, and you save all your money, and you hit up everybody, your parents, and everybody's giving you a little bit so you can buy this stuff. And I wanted a Mamiya 6.7 RZ, because that's what all the pros used. And I saved all my money for this camera. And I went into the store. I had never used one. And I said, that's what I want to buy. And he says, all right. And he picks it up and he puts it in my hand, and it was like a bazooka. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I said, who can work with this thing? And it's like, well, that's what they are. That's what Andy Leibovitz has used. And that's what this guy, and I'm like, how can you work it? You needed a tripod to put this thing on. And it wasn't the tool for me, even though it was the tool that everybody uses. And, he said, well, the Bronica's a little, and he gave me this little medium format camera that nobody bought, no pros used. And that's what I used for 15 or 20 years, because it was the right tool. You didn't see any pros, advertising for it, but, in the end, very rarely do people ask me what kind of equipment I use in my profession.
Yeah, I guess, the old thing, there's always those two schools of thoughts. It takes good tools to make good work. But I remember some of the old timers telling me that it doesn't matter how good the tool is. If you suck, the tool's not going to make your work better.
Of course, exactly.
Where you can make something from nothing, but you can't make nothing with something. Yeah.
Yep.
That was an interesting thing. So where are things looking at for you right now? I mean, what are your goals, dreams, desires, all that stuff?
I'm in a lot of ways, I'm kind of living it now. I think, they forced me to take photography in school. It wasn't like I grew up and got a everybody always has the story. I got a camera when I was 6 years old and I fell in love with it. I didn't fall in love with it. I was forced to take it. I kept on doing it because I had to, and then I kind of liked it, and then I kind of loved it. But I always felt fortunate. Like, I always realized, look, I'm making my living as an artist. Like, that's pretty sweet. I mean, my dad was a good artist too, but he was not afforded the ability. He had to work in a factory because he had to support a family, and he couldn't be an artist and live at that. So being a photographer was always my dream, and I loved it. I get up and play every morning. That's what it feels like. And it started to wear off, and then with this illustration switch, which was a surprise. It was a shock, really. I never thought about doing illustration ever in my life. Never once even dabbled in it until I had to. And now I feel like a 22-year-old artist again. I feel like I'm the kid in school who knows nothing. But I couldn't be more excited to get up every morning and start working, because I don't know much about what I'm doing. I'm just kind of playing. And so I think as an artist, I teach at I teach a course at Mass Art in the summertime. It's a 3-week intensive course for incoming first years. So it's basically for the kids who are coming straight out of high school and have never had college. And this is 3 weeks before they start school. We teach, it's like a boot camp. And so it's a pretty intensive thing. And when they're getting ready to go on the last day, the faculty, we all kind of offer our piece of advice as they head into, to start their careers. And so they said, Dana, you want to say something? I said, yeah. I said, I said to my students, I said, I said, I'm so envious of you. And they're like, oh, I said, where you are and where you're at. And it's like, they said, well, why? I said, well, because you guys know nothing. You have no idea. You don't know a thing about what you're heading into or what you're going to do. You have no experience. You don't know a thing. And they would sit there and stare at me with their mouths open and think like, dude, that's your pep talk going in. We know nothing. I said, yes. I said, because you know nothing, you'll try everything. You don't know what not to do. You don't know any shortcuts. You do everything like a kid because you have no idea what works and what doesn't. And as an artist, as a working photographer and illustrator for 30 years, I would do anything to put myself back there. Because now, if anything, I try nothing. And I only take shortcuts. I have jobs, I have clients, I have to produce, and I have to get things out in 24 hours or 12 hours. And I don't explore and I don't experiment because I know too much. And because of it, my work suffers. And it's so hard to get back to thinking like I'm an 18-year-old. But with illustration, it sort of put me back there. I don't know a thing. I don't know about famous illustrators. I didn't study illustration. I have no training. So I try everything because I don't know any better. But that, I think, fuels my work. That's what makes it interesting and compelling, because I don't really know what it's going to look like until it ends up looking like that. But as an artist, that's gold, so
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I'm living the dream, and, I have pictures in the pub. I worked 25 years as a photographer and I never got one picture in the Washington Post. I worked 1 year as an illustrator and I got 2 features in the Washington Post. So, I still kind of wake up and giggle every time I see my pictures in the paper or on the screen, and thinking, if only they knew.
It's funny because when I was teaching design classes or even advertising classes, I would tell them what the assignment was, and like, why are you going to show us examples? I said, no. Why? I said, because I don't want the example to get stuck in your head, and that's all you're going to be focused on, is how to make whatever you're going to do match that example. And they're like, oh, well, it's not fair. You know what the assignment is. Okay. You know what the narrative is, you know what the emotions are, you know what the product is. That's all you need to know. And it took them a while to finally get a hold of that concept. But And I know what you mean too about that whole idea is if you don't know what you can do wrong, then you're going to just do what you think is right. If you do something wrong, doing something that you think is right, then you'll realize, ooh, I should have done that.
Right,
You know?
and it comes with age. But the other thing I think that fuels me, that I think is so useful, even though it's scary, is desperation. The decisions we make in times of desperation. When I get an assignment and I know that it's due in an hour and I have nothing, I get desperate. And because you're so desperate and you're so afraid, like, I can't blow this, you start making decisions from that place of kind of fearfulness, but it also drives you to places that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And it creates a whole different kind of work or puts you on a different path that you wouldn't have tried if it wasn't because of simple panic. And, while that's scary to be in that place, it's also very useful, I think, for an artist in creating work to, that state of desperation and panic leads to some pretty solid decision making.
It's it's one of those things where I've always been fortunate not to have mental blocks or creative blocks. And in many cases, when the client would be telling me what they wanted for an ad layout or whatever, I'd already see the ad layout as they were speaking.
Mhm.
But then sometimes it would be, okay, and I'm listening and I'm not getting those pictures behind my eyes and I'm going, what the hell? What am I going to do now? And then I realized it was, okay, I'm not in a letting go state of mind.
Mhm.
And then, like you said, and whenever I would hit that, I would do something like vacuum the rug, sweep the floor, wash the dishes, go for a walk, and I wouldn't think about it. And all of a sudden, it was like, boom, there it is. It's like, damn. The
Right.
creative process is really an interesting process. I've been in my own work. My works evolved from abstraction to socially conscious expressionism, and some of the pieces that I did, even though it's psychological reality versus photographic reality, I'm like, okay, this is not my hand. I'm still trying to find my hand, and people like, it's at the end of your wrist. No, my hand. It's like, I hate the word style, but the hand. You can tell somebody's handwriting. That's what I'm trying to say. Um, and I've been planning about a bunch of things out, and I'm doing a painting commemorating an event in my late father-in-law's life, and all of a sudden it just made sense. I'm going to build it on a Renaissance composition by Caravaggio, and as I said, okay, what next? I don't know. So I stopped doing the layouts, and as I'm doing it, it's like, wow, you know what? This is going to be loose. This is what I've been looking to do. It's like bringing back some of that abstract handwork that I was known for without having to sweat. Oh, does it look like him? And it's letting go. It's surrender. It really is surrender.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, while we all have to have a process, it's so different for everybody. Like you just said, like, you can see it in your head. I'm the total opposite. I'm not an ideas guy. The idea of like sitting in a meeting and they say, okay, so Smith, what do you got for me? And I have nothing. I'm
got
always
nothing.
blank. I have nothing for you whatsoever. And the only way that I see things is by moving things around on the canvas. My process, I don't come up with 3 or 4 ideas or concepts. I'm horrible at that. I just start cutting things out and putting them down and moving and pressing buttons. And then all of a sudden something will be like, oh, that's nice. I definitely didn't intend to do that, but it's nice. And then I start working off of that. And then that leads to another thing. And so they're always surprised. They come and say, whoa, I wasn't expecting this. I'm like, neither was I.
It's interesting because you kind of described when I first met my wife, we had hired her. I was working at Spectrum Marketing Group, but we had hired her as a graphic designer, and they moved me from my office to sit next to her so that if she had questions about anything, like all clients all have particularities, and likes and dislikes and such. So instead of having to get on the phone, on the intercom, blah, 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 she'd be right there. And I'm watching her work and I'm going, I've never seen anybody work like that. You're only the second person. Because you just described, she would put something down and she'd move it, then she'd do this. And I'm like, where is she going with this? And yet, she says, I'm a graphic designer by day. I'm a surface designer at night. Surface design is what she loves. That's what sustains her. The graphic design is what supports her, supports us. And it took me a while to get used to that kind of creative process, when I was teaching drawing, I'd always tell, or even painting, I would tell the students this: the three most important marks. Okay, there's only three of them. There's the first one. Okay, and that's where some people that's already a stumbling block. Well, what do I do? What do you want? They have all these dumb questions, and like you said, just put that thing down. Just scribble, do something, get it going. So once you make that first mark, then it's okay. The second mark is the second most difficult, because when you put that down, now you've created a relationship between the first mark and that mark. Is that mark now larger than the first mark? Is the first mark larger than the second mark? It goes back and forth. It's like a very Zen kind of thing, right? And the third mark is probably the most difficult of all. And that's the last one. Know when to walk away.
Right. Yeah. That's tough. Yeah. Like I said, what we were saying earlier, like with photography, your time ends, your time is up. They kick you out of the building and it's over. With the illustration or with painting or most any kind of art, there's always, you come back a day later, it's like, well, just if I just move this, what if I just slide that, what if I just cover that up, and if it wasn't for deadlines, I'd never be done. So
I don't even know if James is a photographer, to tell you the truth, but he is a graphic illustrator. I don't know. He does incredible work. His name is James Morris. He's out of Detroit, and he's a collagist. It's an African-American tradition. African-Americans didn't have the wherewithal to afford pigments and canvases and all that stuff. So they cut out magazines, and they would, and there's almost been a revival in it, and it's incredible. And let me tell you, that is, going back to the days of a swipe file, where you had collected all these magazine, these tear sheets. You tore all these. Oh, there's an elephant. There's an elephant standing on its head. There's an elephant from the left. There's an elephant from the right. So now I got my elephant file going. So that now when you have to do elephants, you go into the file, you look on the elephants, and you go through all the different swipes, right? So I always found that amazing, because how many magazines are there, and you just have to make do or do without. What he's done is he's combined photography and collage together, where he'll say, okay, I'm going to do a portrait of you, Dana, and for your beard, I'm going to go and shoot grass on a frosty morning. So he'll do these shots of grass, and then he'll photo manipulate them and create your beard out of it. And from a distance, it looks like, real hair. And I find that kind of amazing. Some of the stuff that he's done is they're like Byzantine icons. They're just absolutely gorgeous. So there's ways around, right?
Well, and I also think what's interesting about that process too, again, back to the artistic process, I'm sure there's 200 things that could represent a beard, but an artist chooses a frosty morning, grass on a frosty morning, because that's how he processes and that's how he sees. And so for me, that's always the fascinating part, is that, it's like grass and dew and frosty, that decision making, when he could have gone 100 other different ways. And that's what's fascinating about the process, is like, I would have not thought of that, or I definitely would have thought of that. So
right. And then there's also scale, because you look at, the average person say, oh, it's too coarse. Well, if I reduce it and then I flown it
Mhm.
into a pattern, then now I've got the texture that I'm looking for. And because I can manipulate the pattern, so thought, the creativity remains regardless.
Mhm.
Did you ever run across a guy named Bruno Lintz? He was a Brazilian, which I always wondered about the boys in Brazil having this guy named Bruno Lintz.
Bruno Lintz. Yeah. Why do I know?
He was a fashion photographer. This
Yeah,
guy
yeah.
did not
Bruno
have
Lintz.
a motor drive. He never used lights. He always used ambient light. And this guy could be talking to you, shooting actually from his hip. And he looks at these photographs of, he primarily, focused on women. But you look at some of these photographs and you go, oh my God, they were just unbelievable, unbelievable. And I always wondered about him. I think about him often.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has, just like their process, their style. And, I think it's funny because I would say once every 3 years, I get called to do a fashion, I wouldn't even call it a fashion shoot, a fashion-like shoot. Some editor or some art director will have an idea of, let's take somebody who knows nothing about fashion, which would be me, and has nothing, none of his style represents fashion, which would definitely be me. And let's have them do a fashion shoot. Let's have them photograph models, and they always think it's going to be a good idea, and it never works out that way. But they, I think it's that desire to, like, let's come at this from a totally different point of view and see if something wonderful happens. And usually it didn't. Usually it was a mess. Everybody regretted it. It was just like, dude, you don't belong here, and I can't work with a team, and let's all agree to never do this again. But I think that's also the key to being a good art director is knowing who to pull in when to communicate whatever it is, a particular idea that you're trying to convey. And that's key. So I don't stress about that anymore because I know no one's going to call me to do fashion. So I'm not going to be out of my league or over my head. And, I think, when you do this for a long time, you just want to know that when they call you, that for the most part, they're saying, Dana, do your thing. Ron, we want you to do the Ron thing. Go. There's going to be art direction in there because there are certain things boxes that need to be checked. But for the most part, they're calling, if they're doing their job, they're choosing the right artist for the right job. And that's, I think, where I am now professionally too. I'll lose a lot of jobs because I don't check the right boxes, but at least I know for the most part, the clients that call me in, they're saying, look, we've seen your work. Please do that for us. Which makes it a lot easier. Students don't have that luxury. Students have to take everything. And that's why it's so scary when you don't know anything, because they grab a job doing advertising work in a studio and they have no idea how to do it. But they don't want to turn down the job, and it turns into a nightmare so often because it's just, but
Food and jewelry, they find out really, really fast that you've got to be, that is a learned or an acquired skill to shoot food and jewelry.
Jewelry, glass, anything. I had to shoot Fitbits, stacks of Fitbits. They wanted them to look like Jenga. And, I got it done, but it took me about, like 3 weeks longer than it would for the advertising person they should have called in the first place. Because so much trial and error. I didn't know what I was doing. I got it done, but I shouldn't have been doing that job. But it's good money.
And then of course, there's always there's a client that you've got to deal with, and is the art director, and then a creative director you've got to deal with. And a friend of mine who's a videographer, Emmy award-winning video producer, said that they were at a shoot someplace. It was adjacent to an airport, and they just couldn't get the right effect. It was at night or whatever, and the art director said, "Well, can't they just shut off the lights in the airport?"
Yeah, exactly. No big deal.
Yeah, sure. There are 375 people on that plane. They really won't care.
Exactly. All right, there, Spielberg. Yeah, whatever you need.
If the pilot lands by field.
Yeah. Okay.
We're gonna wrap this up, Dana. This has been great having you. It's amazing. And again, I tell people it's just a conversation. I have no agenda whatsoever. I have no idea where this is going to go. But at this point, my question is, if you had anything to do over, what would it be? and how would you do it over?
It's funny. I never assisted coming up. As a photographer, I would tell my students, get out there and assist. You got to work for professionals and learn how everything works. And basically, you get to see them sweat and work with everything, but you can go home and sleep at night where they can't. I suppose I would do that. But even that, I kind of look at it's kind of like that life question, do you have any regrets? What would you do over? But if I were to do it over, it wouldn't turn out the way it has. If I would have assisted, I would have learned a lot quicker. But learning a lot quicker would have put me on a different path. And I might have, maybe learning quicker means that I was not ignorant for as long as I was. But a lot of times that ignorance, like we were just talking about, not knowing what not to do, helped me get to where I was. Making mistakes. I'm not the concept guy. I'm a good recognizer. And I have to I have to make a lot of really bad decisions before I recognize the good decisions. So I really think all of our processes are custom made for us. So I really wouldn't change much. I mean, at 57 years old, I feel like a 10-year-old waking up in the morning with a new box of crayons and a new drawing pad, and anything that I can think of, I'm going to create today. That would have been my dream when I started. It was my dream all along, and it's still my dream. And I mean, if in 10 years, I don't know, maybe I'm doing sculpture. Maybe I'm writing poetry or whatever. I think what I realized with photography, I always thought I loved photography, but as I'm not so much a photographer anymore, I don't miss it that much. And I think I realized because all I really want to do is wake up and be able to create. And that was really what I love. And so I don't think it matters what I'm creating as long as I'm fortunate enough to be able to create for a living. And so I wouldn't change that much because, for me, too much thinking has never been a good thing. So kind of aimlessly just moving forward and doing what you have to do, I think has led me to a pretty good place. So I kind of keep it the way it turned out.
Good answer. Good answer. Because we found an old photo. My cousin found an old photograph of my dad from when he was living in Canada, and in with her dad's stuff after her dad passed away, my uncle Armin. And I looked at that photograph, and it was like, my God, it was. This is like, if you look at a pinball machine, this is a bumper photo, because everything that occurred previous to that photograph and everything that would happen after that photograph was absolutely amazing. And I look back in time, if I hadn't have done this wouldn't have happened, that wouldn't have happened, this wouldn't have happened. So yeah, the do-overs it's a silly thing. There are no do-overs. Do or do not.
Right. I mean, what I can only imagine the mess I would make if I had a second chance at this. I don't want to go there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. Dana Smith, thanks so much. Photographer extraordinaire. Glad to have bumped into you walking the dog.
I know. I knew you were in the area.
I often wondered about whatever happened to you. So. Yeah.
Well, I think you're on the second shift. I think I go out at 6:15, and I think you might be the 6:45 shift. So we usually miss each other. But
yeah, because Daisy eats at 7, and then sometimes she'll have half of her. Well, she has her meds, and then she has half of her breakfast, and then we go out. So that's usually 7:15. So we're a full hour difference. Yeah. But it's great. Well, folks, that wraps up another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Artist Index. And until the next time, just get through the day one minute at a time, step by step. That's all it takes. Thanks so much, and we'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.